Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come to life in the dark. Before sleep catches up with you, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself go, because what you are about to hear is real. Case 1. On March 22nd at 2:17 a.m., a security alert from the Blackwood Tower penthouse triggered an immediate police response. Upon arrival, officers found the door locked from the inside and no sign of forced entry. When they gained entry, the scene seemed clear. Peter Talbot, a senior Canon Ebersol executive, lay dead on a leather couch with a syringe protruding from his arm. To Detective Henry Graves, with more than 20 years in homicide, it all seemed like a typical overdose case. A businessman with a stressful life, a secret addiction, and a night that ended in the worst way. On the coffee table was a half-empty wine glass, a plate of leftover salad, and a jar of dressing. Nothing seemed out of place, but something didn't fit. Graves surveyed the scene closely. Talbot was neatly dressed, his clothes tidy and with no signs of a struggle. He looked at the arm where the syringe still hung. There were no marks from previous injections, no scars, no bruises, unusual for someone who supposedly used heroin. If he really was a frequent user, his skin should show traces of the habit. He looked away from the table. The salad plate caught his eye. Talbot appeared to have been eating normally before injecting himself. If he was an addict, why would he consume the drug in a way that would kill him immediately? Something didn't make sense. Following his intuition, he took a leaf of lettuce with gloves and put it in an evidence bag. He ordered an immediate toxicological analysis. The result confirmed his suspicions. The salad contained heroin in doses high enough to enter the bloodstream without the need for an injection. Then, the scene made sense. Someone had put the drug in his food without his knowledge. As he ate his dinner, his body began to absorb the substance. When he began to feel strange, dizzy, confused, his first reaction was to inject what he thought was his usual dose, unaware that he already had heroin in his system. That last injection was enough to drive him to a fatal overdose. Talbot had not been killed directly. He had been manipulated to kill himself. A meticulously planned crime, designed to look like an accidental overdose. But it was now clear that someone, at some point in the night, had dosed his food with the intention of making sure he didn't survive. What seemed like a closed case turned into a murder investigation. Someone within his circle had wanted him dead, and he had succeeded without getting his hands dirty. Detective Henry Graves was quick to run a background check on Peter Talbot. He was a key executive at Canon Ebersol, a senior figure in the firm with access to financial and strategic information about the company. What caught his attention, however, was a disturbing detail. Talbot had disappeared hours before a crucial meeting with investors. Interviews with building staff confirmed that he had not left Blackwood Tower. No one had seen him leave his penthouse after the evening, indicating that sometime between dinner and his death, something had happened that left him incapacitated. But what really turned the tide of the investigation was the analysis of his bank accounts. Graves discovered a series of suspicious transactions. Large sums of money were flowing into Talbot's personal accounts from multiple sources, all coming from different companies. The strange thing was that none of these payments were directly linked to Canon Ebersol. There were no invoices, contracts, or supporting documents in the company's books. They were black money, movements that indicated bribes, kickbacks, or some kind of extortion. If Talbot was operating outside the company, someone must have helped him handle those transactions without arousing suspicion. And the first person Graves needed to question was Martin Rydell, Canon Ebersol's accountant. Martin Rydell arrived at the police station with the same attitude as any accountant caught up in a financial investigation, confident that he was only there to clear up numbers. But as soon as he sat down, he knew the conversation would not be about simple accounting irregularities. On the table in front of him were Peter Talbot's bank statements. Anomalous transactions, payments from companies unrelated to Canon Ebersol, money moving in circles with no clear purpose. There were no unnecessary questions. The evidence spoke for itself. Talbot was running a cash flow outside the firm, and Rydell was helping him hide it. At first he tried to deny it, but it didn't take him long to realize that Detective Graves already had all the pieces of the puzzle. Instead of continuing to lie, he changed his strategy. Minimize his role in everything. It wasn't his money. It wasn't his idea. He was just doing what he was asked to do. He didn't ask why or where the money came from, he just moved it around and made it disappear from the official books. When he realized that wasn't enough, he blurted out something else. Talbot was not only accepting irregular payments, but he had begun to take advantage of the information he obtained. He had clients, competitors, and influential figures under his control. He knew what they wanted, what they were doing in the shadows, and, most dangerously, what they had to lose. He wasn't just taking money, he demanded it. The key was in the black book that Graves placed on the table. It was not just a list of transactions, it was a catalog of services, names, dates, and compromising details. A menu of high-end prostitutes, many of them linked to strategic clients. Services offered, prices, even personal notes about his clients' preferences and weaknesses. Talbot not only facilitated meetings, he used them as a weapon. If someone decided to sever the business relationship, Talbot had a way of making sure they thought twice before doing so. But he had gone too far. He had started extorting money from the wrong people. Not small businessmen or medium-sized investors. We're talking about people with real power, those who wouldn't let a problem like him grow too big. This was where Rydell was most uncomfortable. Not only did he admit that he knew what Talbot was doing, but he made it clear that the situation had escalated out of control. It was no longer discrete transactions or financial favors. It was a bomb about to explode, and Talbot didn't see it coming. The question was whether Rydell was simply involved in the scheme, or whether he saw Talbot's death as the only way to save himself. After all, if Talbot went down, he was taking him down with him. Eliminating him was not only convenient, it was a guarantee of survival. Graves knew that people with the kind of money and power Talbot extorted didn't get their hands dirty. If one of his clients wanted to take him out, he would have hired a professional, a hitman, someone efficient and quiet. But the way Talbot died didn't fit that profile. Detective Henry Graves came to Canon Ebersol knowing he would not find answers easily. In the corporate world, the truth was rarely delivered without conditions, especially when millions of dollars were at stake. He rode the glass elevator up to the executive floor, where he was greeted by a revealing scene. Jim Folks, the firm's chief investment officer, was mired in a sea of documents trying to contain the collateral damage that Peter Talbot's death had unleashed. Next to him, Donna Kaplan, Talbot's personal secretary, was reviewing files with a tense face and dark circles under her eyes. Graves watched her closely. He knew that in firms like this, secretaries often knew more than the executives themselves, and Donna didn't look like a mere bystander to the crisis. Folks didn't wait for the first question. He knew why Graves was there. Since Talbot's death, Canon Ebersol had gone into a storm. Companies that had once dealt with them were now extorting money from them to keep certain compromised documents from coming to light. What had begun as a series of shady transactions under Talbot's leadership had now become an uncontrollable risk for the entire firm. Talbot had played with fire for too long, and suddenly, his death solved too many problems. But there was a difference between profiting from someone's death and having planned it. Graves had to find out which side of the line Folks was on. How far was he involved? Did he know Talbot was extorting money from the wrong people? Had he made the decision to take him out before it all blew up? Folks was unfazed. Instead of responding, he slid a folder across the table. Medical records. Proof that he had been in the hospital the night of the murder. Proof that physically he could not have been at the scene of the crime. A solid alibi. But Graves wasn't looking for a killer who had stabbed Talbot in a dark alley. This wasn't a crime of passion or a common score settling. It was a calculated strike. Folks didn't need to get his hands dirty to see the problem go away. All indications were that someone within the company had acted on his own, and if Folks was being completely honest in stating that he did not order the execution, then there was another more disturbing question. Who inside the company decided that Talbot had to die? It was at that moment that Graves looked back at Donna Kaplan. Unlike Folks, the secretary did not have a lawyer or a public relations team to protect her. She had been working alongside Talbot for years, knowing his routines, his dealings, and his darkest secrets. If anyone at Canon Ebersol had witnessed his downfall, it was her. But what unsettled Graves was another possibility. What if Donna had not only been a witness, but a key cog in his downfall? If Talbot was out of control and his greed had put him in the crosshairs of powerful people, someone had to have sounded the alarm before it was too late. Someone within his circle, someone with access to his information and with enough confidence to know exactly when and how he was moving money. Graves watched as Donna looked away and pursed her lips. He had seen that gesture before, not on violent criminals, but on people who knew more than they were saying and were waiting for the right moment to speak. The question was no longer whether Donna knew anything. The question was how much she had known before Talbot ended up dead. If Talbot was removed because he was an unacceptable risk, someone inside Canon Ebersol had to have made the decision. And the person closest to him, the one who could have warned about his instability, was the same person who was now sitting next to Folks, helping him cover up the disaster. Donna Kaplan wasn't just Talbot's secretary. She was the linchpin who had kept him in control. And when he was no longer controllable, it was she who probably tipped Folks off that there was no turning back. Henry Graves had questioned many people in his career, but few like Donna Kaplan. She was no ordinary witness, nor was she someone who could be dismissed as just a secretary caught in a web of corruption. From the moment she entered the interrogation room, she knew she was dealing with someone different. Confident, measured, with no trace of nervousness. She had prepared for this. His track record confirmed it. Years working in the highest circles of Canon Ebersol, moving easily among the firm's most powerful executives. Always close to the important decisions, always aware of what was going on behind the scenes. She wasn't just Talbot's assistant. She was his gatekeeper, the one who managed his schedule, screened his calls, and, when necessary, cleaned up his messes. But Talbot had crossed a line. His greed led him to extort money from people who were too powerful, people who would not tolerate mistakes. Graves knew that she understood him better than anyone, and that, at some point, she had stopped protecting him. When presented with the evidence, he made no attempt to defend Talbot, nor did he deny his involvement in the firm's shady dealings. He knew the detective was already clear. Instead, he did something unexpected. He blurted out two names, Aaron Ward and Dan Cho. Aaron Ward, friend and acquaintance of the victim, with whom he had maintained an ambiguous relationship. He was not directly linked to Canon Ebersol, but his closeness to Talbot had put him on the radar of the investigation. If anyone knew Talbot's less public face, it was him. Dan Cho, Jim Folks' main competitor within Canon Ebersol. A man with the same level of power and influence, but with one key difference. His future at the company depended directly on Talbot's fall and Folks' loss of control. If Talbot was out of the way, next in line was Folks. Graves watched Donna as she called out the names. He wasn't rambling. He wasn't trying to divert attention. He had chosen what information to blurt out with precision, making it clear that Talbot was not the only piece in this game. The question now was simple. Which of these two names was close enough to ensure that Talbot did not survive? Detective Henry Graves knew that Aaron Ward was not just another employee at Canon Ebersol. His history within Peter Talbot's corporate environment showed that he had held an ambiguous position, not reaching the power levels of key executives, but always moving in the circle of important decisions. If there was something hidden within the firm, Ward probably knew about it. When he was seated in the interrogation room, his attitude gave him away before he said a word. He was not nervous, but neither was he defiant. He knew exactly how far he could talk without incriminating himself. Graves wasted no time in bringing to the table documents linking Ward to a series of irregular financial transactions, payments without clear justification, deposits into external accounts and connections to people who, at the time, were already suspects in the investigation. Most alarmingly, Ward had been receiving money from sources outside the company and, when those funds were traced, all roads led to one name: Dan Cho. When confronted with this information, Ward made no attempt to deny it. He didn't argue, he didn't feign surprise. He simply admitted that he worked in corporate espionage. His job was to collect information within Canon Ebersol, record financial movements, identify weaknesses in management, and ultimately pass that data on to his employer. And his employer was Dan Cho. Nothing more. He did not admit to knowing about Talbot's death. He did not name any more names. He did not attempt to justify his involvement in the secret information network within the firm. But the damage had already been done. If Cho was employing someone like Ward to get inside information, that meant the power struggle within Canon Ebersol had reached levels where assassination was not a distant possibility, but a strategy. What remained to be discovered was whether Cho was just playing dirty at the corporate level, or whether he had moved the necessary pieces to have Talbot eliminated. And if that was the case, Ward had been the key that let him know when and how to do it. Detective Henry Graves knew that Dan Cho was not an easy man to question. His record within Canon Ebersol was filled with strategic moves, aggressive promotions, and the quiet elimination of competitors, but nothing in his file linked him directly to crimes. His reputation was not that of a killer, but of a man who knew how to play the corporate game without getting his hands dirty. When Cho arrived at the station, his attitude was that of someone who had already calculated every possible question. He knew he would be called. He knew his name was on the list of suspects. But what he made clear from the beginning was his firm conviction that Peter Talbot was more used to him alive than dead. According to Cho, he had been gathering information about Talbot for months. Not out of revenge, but as a strategy to get rid of Jim Folks. The key was not just the money Talbot was moving under the radar, but the corrupt connections within the firm. With enough evidence, Cho could have exposed Talbot and Folks' entire network, eliminating his biggest rival within the company in one fell swoop. But Talbot's death had changed everything. Now, instead of a gun, he had a problem. The information he had on Talbot could be useful, but without his testimony it could not be used as effectively. What had been a calculated move turned into an unforeseen crisis. Someone else had decided to eliminate Talbot before he could bring him down publicly, and that meant there was someone else in the shadows with a completely different plan. When Graves pressed about his relationship with Aaron Ward, Cho did not deny it. He admitted hiring him to obtain information, but insisted that his intention was never to orchestrate an assassination. Talbot was an asset, not an obstacle. As long as he was alive, Cho could use him. Dead, he only created more questions. What was clear from the conversation was that if Cho was telling the truth, Talbot's murder was not just a power grab within Canon Ebersol. Someone eliminated him because his presence was an immediate risk, not only to the company, but to people outside of it, and that someone was still at large. The entire investigation was leading to a single point. Every hidden transaction, every testimony, every conspiracy within Canon Ebersol revolved around someone who handled all the information, someone who knew Talbot's movements better than anyone else. Detective Henry Graves knew this. So, in the interrogation room, across from him, was Donna Kaplan. From the beginning, Kaplan had played her role to perfection. She was neither a high-level executive nor a shareholder with a stake in the company. She was not on the financial books with large sums of money, nor did she have the profile of someone who would directly benefit from Talbot's death. But that was exactly the point. She didn't need power. She controlled those who had it. For years, Kaplan had been the keeper of Canon Ebersol's secrets. She managed the agenda, filtered information, and was the liaison between the top management. Not only did she know what was going on inside the firm, she knew who to protect and who to sacrifice. When Talbot began to spiral out of control, when he stopped being a useful cog and became a threat, Kaplan made the decision no one else was willing to make. It was she who kept him safe until it was no longer convenient. It was she who warned Jim Folks that Talbot was digging his own grave, and it was she who executed the final move. The evidence was in the details. Kaplan was the last person to see Talbot alive. She was the only one who had access to his food before his death. And she was the only one at Canon Ebersol with the power to manipulate the scene without arousing suspicion. Talbot was not killed by the betrayal of a rival or the wrath of a powerful client. He died because someone in his close circle decided they could no longer protect him. Donna Kaplan didn't need to use a gun or get her hands dirty. All she did was make sure Talbot did what he was already destined to do: destroy himself. When Detective Graves looked into her eyes, she knew there would be no confession. There was no need for one. The case was solved. Donna Kaplan's trial captured the attention of the financial and legal media. The prosecution presented a strong case: tampering with evidence, conspiracy to commit murder, and concealment of financial crimes. There were no fingerprints, no direct witnesses to the moment she contaminated Peter Talbot's food, but the records, the hidden transactions, and the way she orchestrated the hit were undeniable. The circumstantial evidence was strong enough to seal his fate. The jury did not take long to deliberate. Kaplan was convicted of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit corporate fraud. She received a 25-year prison sentence with no possibility of parole for the first 18 years. Canon Ebersol scrambled to clean up its image, but the damage was done. The stock fell, investors walked away, and the company's name was tarnished by the scandal. As for Kaplan, he never showed remorse. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He just listened to the sentence with the same calculating expression with which he had handled the firm's most powerful men. In the end, it wasn't corporate justice or power struggles that got her. It was her own arrogance in thinking she could control everything. Case 2. Chandler Memorial Hospital was a prestigious medical center, known for its highly skilled staff and advanced technology. But something didn't add up. A patient had died, and his family was not convinced it was from natural causes. Detective Henry Graves arrived at the morgue to verify the case. The official cause: heart failure in a patient with terminal brain cancer, an expected outcome for someone in his condition. However, the son of the deceased insisted that his father had been stable until a few hours before his death. He suspected that he had been poisoned with epinephrine. Graves was not interested in unsubstantiated theories, but something gave him pause. He decided to check other files in the morgue. He looked for patterns, and there they were. Multiple patients had died under similar conditions in recent months. People in critical but stable states who suddenly suffered a fulminant cardiac collapse. Always at night. Always when there were fewer staff in the hospital. An unsettling thought crossed his mind. This was not just an isolated case. He could be facing an angel of death. Someone inside the hospital was making decisions on his own. Someone who was not only letting patients die, but choosing who lived and who did not. Detective Henry Graves decided to focus the investigation on the most recent victim, Trent Kelty. A patient with terminal brain cancer and heart problems, his death did not seem unexpected at first glance. But his family's testimony, coupled with the report of epinephrine poisoning, indicated that something else was going on. Kelty's story revealed his vulnerability. He had lost his sight and lived in isolation. His only companion was Jacqueline, his neighbor, who had cared for him in his last months of life. His dependence on others made him an easy target. But when Graves reviewed the records of other patients who had died under similar conditions, he found something even more disturbing. Samantha Cropsey. Unlike Kelty, Cropsey was not terminally ill. According to her medical records, she had been admitted with a treatable condition, but her records were altered to indicate that she was suffering from an irreversible disease. The problem was that this information did not match her previous diagnoses. This changed everything. If the killer only eliminated terminally ill patients, it could be argued that he had a twisted logic, a kind of perverse compassion. But Cropsey was not dying. Someone altered his file to justify his death. That meant that the killer not only decided who died, but also constructed his own version of reality to facilitate it. He was no longer just an angel of death. He was someone with access to hospital records, and someone with the power to decide who deserved to live and who did not. Now, Graves had to find out who inside Chandler Memorial Hospital was manipulating life and death. Detective Henry Graves had seen many things in his career, but few so methodical, so organized, so cold. Dr. Mason Baldwin was not just a surgeon with a troubled history. He was a man who operated on the boundaries of medical ethics and illegality. Chief of surgery at Chandler Memorial Hospital, he still retained his prestige despite having 2 surgical deaths under his responsibility. He avoided jail, but not surveillance. He was on probation, a surgeon with a record, but still with full access to patients, drugs, and, most importantly, organs. That was the key. It wasn't just that Baldwin had access to medical records. It was what he did with them. Graves was not direct this time. He let him talk, let him maintain his posture as a busy surgeon, let him pretend he had nothing to do with the deaths. And then he released the documents. Samantha Cropsey, a patient who, according to the records, was terminally ill. But that was false. Someone altered his file. His medication was reduced before his death. Enough for him to suffer more. Enough for him to die without anyone questioning anything. Baldwin barely reacted. He expected it. Then came the Trent Kelty case. Terminal brain cancer. Heart failure. Nothing surprising in his death, except for the traces of epinephrine in his body. Baldwin continued in silence. But Graves wasn't finished, because this time, the detective had something else. The doses of medication administered at the hospital, the amount of opioids, anesthetics, and sedatives did not add up. Patients were receiving less than what was recorded in the system. Someone was diverting medications. Baldwin exhaled slowly, the first sign of discomfort. It was a perfect system. The patients did not complain. They couldn't. They were terminal. People who were already in their last days. Who would notice if they suffered a little more? Drugs that were not used were sold. And then there were the organs. The donation records did not match the dates of the deaths. Kelty had been registered as a donor after his death. Baldwin tried to remain calm, but the evidence was crushing him. He could not deny what was already on the table. He sold leftover doses. He altered records to ensure that certain patients died on time. But then, Graves cornered him with the ultimate test, the surgical clamp, found on Kelty's body, physical evidence that someone tampered with his body after his death. Baldwin looked at the evidence bag. This time he did not smile. Finally he spoke, not to deny, but to defend himself. Yes, he altered the records. Yes, he reduced medication. Yes, he sold drugs and facilitated the death of certain patients to ensure that their organs were usable. But it was not the angel of death. The epinephrine in Kelty, he did not administer it. The patients died when he decided, but someone else intervened ahead of schedule. His alibi saved him. He was on a train when Kelty died. It could not have been him. Baldwin was arrested. Medical fraud, drug trafficking, organ sales. But the real killer was still at large, because Baldwin was just laying the groundwork. The real angel of death was still in the hospital, waiting for his next victim. It was clear to Detective Henry Graves that Dr. Cahill was not like Baldwin. He didn't have the same arrogance, the same cool confidence that came with years of well-calculated cover-ups. When Cahill entered the interrogation room, his hands were trembling slightly. His gaze avoided direct contact and his breathing was faster than normal. He knew he was in trouble. It was just not yet clear what kind of trouble. Graves started with basic questions. His role at the hospital, his shifts, his responsibilities. Cahill answered without too much difficulty, but his nervousness was evident. Every time the detective mentioned the angel of death, his body tensed. That was the first clue. When asked about the night Trent Kelty died, his answer was inconsistent. He said he had been in another wing of the hospital, then that he had come up for air, then that he had been in a patient's bathroom. Too many versions for something so simple. Then Graves was more direct. He pointed out the real reason Cahill was under suspicion: his addiction to morphine. Hospital records showed irregularities in the administration of opioids, something Baldwin had exploited, but which Cahill appeared to have used for himself. The doctor looked away and let out a nervous laugh. He did not try to deny it. Yes, he had used morphine. He injected it during night shifts, when the hospital was quieter. And his alibi for the night of Kelty's death? He got high in a patient bathroom, alone. Graves didn't believe his answer right away. There were too many loose ends. Where exactly was he? Who could confirm it? Why had he changed his testimony more than once? But the lack of direct evidence protected him. Yes, Cahill had problems. Yes, Cahill hid behind anesthesia to cope with his work. Yes, Cahill was unstable. But he was not a murderer. There was no trace of epinephrine in his chart. He did not have access to the altered records. And most importantly, it had no pattern. The angel of death did not kill at random. He selected his victims. Cahill had no control over who died and who did not. He was ruled out as a suspect, not because he was innocent, but because he did not fit the profile. But someone else does. Graves knew this. The real killer was still in the hospital. The atmosphere in the interrogation room was different this time. There was no aggressive tension as with Baldwin, no restrained desperation as with Cahill. There was something heavier, denser, a sense of inevitability. Evelyn Moore sat calmly. She did not tremble. She did not avoid the detective's gaze, but neither did she hold it with defiance. Her posture was not that of someone fighting for her innocence, but of someone who knows that her role in history has already been written. Her record described her as a nurse with an impeccable track record. 20 years at Chandler Memorial. Always on night shifts, always in the last hours of the most critical patients. No one in the hospital knew better the agony of those in their final days. The documents were on the table. Medical records of deceased patients. All under his supervision. All deaths in circumstances that seemed natural, but which, when viewed together, formed a pattern impossible to ignore. The evidence was clear. He had not administered the epinephrine, but it had been there, always. His signature appeared on reports where medication was reduced, where dosage changes were justified, where medical records were adjusted so that deaths were not questioned. The hospital at dawn was another world. The empty corridors, the silence cut only by the machines monitoring vital signs. Outside the lights of the city, the noise of traffic, the life that went on without knowing that, in cold rooms, someone was breathing for the last time. She had witnessed it all. Of the motionless bodies in beds that hours before housed people still clinging to life. Of family members who came only during visiting hours, with flowers and smiles, only to disappear when night fell. None of this was unknown to her. None of this surprised her. But the lack of surprise was not proof of guilt. Knowing is not the same as doing. The documents did not lie. His signature was there. Not on the fatal orders, but in the margins of every story. He had seen how terminal patients suffered as the night progressed. The cries of pain in darkened rooms, the pleas of those who no longer wanted to wake up. The hospital operated under strict rules. Doctors treated, nurses cared, time decided. But at some point someone decided that time was no longer enough. It was not in his official file, but his name was written in every corner of those deaths. Not with ink, but with omission. He never lifted a syringe, never injected a lethal dose. But he was there. He watched, he allowed, he justified. He did not denounce the changes in the files. It did not question when a death came ahead of schedule. It did not stop those who did it. He didn't do it because he believed it was the right thing to do, because he understood it. The angel of death did not act alone. There was always someone to open the door. And Evelyn Moore had held the door open for too long. The investigation was almost closed. The deaths were confirmed as murders. Baldwin was altering records. Moore was justifying the deaths. Cahill was a weak link in the hospital's web of corruption. But none of them had been present for all the shifts. Evelyn Moore was not the angel of death, she was just protecting her identity. Mason Baldwin was not the angel of death, he was just facilitating his work. Cahill was not the angel of death, he was just another addict in the system. But Detective Henry Graves knew something was missing. Each death occurred at night. Each patient died under circumstances that, when viewed individually, seemed natural. But when connected, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone was always present. Not a doctor, not a nurse. Someone who observed everything. Doctors would arrive, do their rounds and leave. Nurses would do their shifts, see patients and then be replaced. But there was one worker at the hospital who never changed shifts, never rotated, never missed a shift. Someone who saw the suffering of patients every night. Someone who did not make medical decisions but had access to everything. Someone who could move without arousing suspicion because he was always there, always in the background, always invisible. The answer was so obvious that Graves felt angry that he hadn't seen it sooner. The killer was not a doctor. She was not a nurse. He was the cleaner, always in the corridors, always inside the rooms, always near the patients when their bodies were found lifeless, always on night shifts. No one paid attention to those who clean. No one questions them. No one looks twice at them. But he saw everything. He saw the pain, the pleas, the suffering, and he decided it was his job to end it. Detective Henry Graves knew he was in the final phase. He had walked every hallway of Chandler Memorial, questioned every suspect, reviewed every file. Baldwin was altering medical records. Moore was protecting the killer. Cahill was a weak link in the system, but none of them was the real angel of death. The only one who had been present at all the deaths was Danilo Gura, the janitor. No one suspected him at first. He was invisible, a shadow moving through the hospital corridors, picking up what others left behind. But he had seen everything. Graves did not summon him to the station. He waited for him at the hospital, in the same restroom where he spent the nights after cleaning the rooms where patients had died. The janitor entered without resistance. He did not seem surprised. He did not ask for explanations. He sat down opposite the detective with the calmness of someone who already knew his destination. Graves slid a document onto the table, a file. It was not about dead patients. It was about him. Danilo Gura was not just a janitor. He had been a doctor in Ukraine, a man who had worked in war hospitals, where decisions were brutal, where lives were measured in minutes and deaths were inevitable. He had come to the United States looking for a new life. But what he found at Chandler Memorial outraged him. Physicians like Baldwin, who saw patients as numbers in a system. Nurses like Moore, who followed orders without question. Relatives who arrived with flowers during the day and disappeared when the night brought the real pain. He saw the suffering. He decided to end it. Graves cornered him with the evidence. He didn't need to press him. Gura admitted each death with surgical precision. It was not impulsive. It was not an outburst. Each patient had been studied. Each dose of epinephrine was accurately measured. He did not consider himself a killer. He considered himself a solution, an angel of death. A search of his residence revealed the final evidence, a notebook. 9 names, 9 patients, dates, symptoms, notes on their condition, every death recorded, every decision documented. He didn't need anyone to defend him. He didn't need anyone to understand him. For him, what he did was necessary. But for Graves, it was simple. Danilo Gura was not a savior. He was a murderer, and his reign at Chandler Memorial was over. The trial of Danilo Gura was an event that shook the healthcare system and public opinion. The janitor who for years went unnoticed in the halls of Chandler Memorial now occupied the center of the courtroom, facing justice for his crimes. There were no pleas, no attempts at apologies. Gura did not deny what he did. His defense was based on a single idea. He was not a murderer. He was a liberator. The testimonies of the victims' families filled the courtroom with anger, pain, and confusion. Some wept inconsolably, wondering if their loved ones would really have wanted to die that way. Others, with trembling voices, asserted that Gura had no right to make a decision that did not belong to him. But amid all the outrage, there were also uncomfortable silences. Some family members deep down wondered if their loved ones had truly found relief in their final moments. The prosecution left no doubt. Every death was premeditated, every dose of epinephrine carefully administered, every file manipulated to cover up the crimes. The records found in Gura's residence were the ultimate proof. Every name was documented, with dates and details about his symptoms. This was not an impulsive act or an outburst of compassion. It was a plan executed with surgical precision. The verdict was unanimous. 9 counts of first-degree murder. Sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Danilo Gura went from a silent specter in the hospital to a nameless prisoner in a system that offered him no escape. But Gura's downfall was not the end of the scandal. The case uncovered deep flaws within Chandler Memorial Hospital. Dr. Mason Baldwin was stripped of his medical license and convicted of fraud and trafficking in controlled substances. His role in altering records and selling drugs was exposed, although a direct link to the deaths could never be proven. He served a 15-year prison sentence, while his reputation and career were completely destroyed. Evelyn Moore, the nurse who had protected the angel of death, did not face criminal charges. Legally, she never administered the lethal doses or participated directly in the murders. However, her signature on the reports and her silence made her a figure of repudiation within the medical community. She lost her job, was disqualified from practice, and disappeared from the public eye, condemned to oblivion and the contempt of her colleagues. Chandler Memorial Hospital never recovered from the scandal. Federal investigations revealed a system riddled with negligence, corruption, and cover-ups. Gura's deaths were just the tip of the iceberg. Patients not receiving proper treatment, records altered to adjust statistics, doctors and administrators more concerned about finances than human life. Lawsuits piled up, investors withdrew their support, and in less than a year, the hospital closed its doors for good. What was once a symbol of medical care ended up a derelict building, a reminder of what happens when ethics are corrupted from within. The angel of death was caught, but the real condemnation was not only Gura's, it was that of a system that allowed everything to happen without asking questions. Case 3. The rain fell relentlessly on brownstone, turning the streets into a patchwork of lights reflected in dark puddles. In the distance, the wail of a police siren broke the murmur of the sleepy city. At 2:47 a.m., a garbage collector discovered Trent Annunzio's body among the debris in an alley in the business district. His pale, rain-soaked face was tilted skyward. His eyes, or what was left of them, were now 2 dark, lifeless holes. The paramedics arrived first, but there was nothing to be done. The Asian studies professor had been executed with 2 precise shots to both eyes. There were no signs of a struggle, no bruising, no defensive wounds. The murder was not an impulsive act, it was a message. Detective Henry Graves arrived minutes later. He surveyed the scene cautiously, analyzing details that others might overlook. Next to the body, a soggy envelope rested on the wet asphalt. Inside was a sheet of paper with Thai characters written in firm, controlled handwriting. A meter away, a gold pendant, torn from the victim's neck, glittered under the light of the nearest street lamp. But the most disturbing thing was on the floor. Among the pools of blood, incense ashes were scattered in a pattern too neat to be accidental. This was not a simple homicide. It was a calculated, almost ceremonial execution. Trent Annunzio had spent months in Thailand, researching Asian art and culture. His return to the United States had been sudden, as if he had abandoned his work without warning. Perhaps he knew something he wasn't supposed to know. Perhaps he brought with him a secret that someone was willing to keep quiet. But if the murder was a message, for whom was it intended? Trent Annunzio, 42, was not just a university professor. He was an enigmatic figure, respected in academic circles but embroiled in personal relationships that complicated his public image. A lecturer in Asian studies at Garrison University, his life was divided between the classroom and research trips. But his abrupt return from Thailand left him exposed to something he may not have expected. He had only been in the United States for a week. His stay in Asia was supposed to last for months, but without explanation, he returned earlier than planned. Since then, according to colleagues and students, his behavior had changed. He was restless, more reserved than usual, as if something was chasing him even when he was thousands of miles away. Among his belongings, the imprint of his journey was still present. His tie with traditional tie patterns was still knotted around his neck when he was found dead. Next to his body, an envelope with Thai characters, soaked by the rain. But if anything made him a figure of interest, it was his history of personal relationships. Married to June, a former student he met in China, their marriage had been the subject of controversy from the start. The age difference, rumors at the university, and the power dynamic between teacher and student marked their relationship. Despite everything, they were still together, at least in appearance. But in his close entourage, there was someone else. Brenna O'Brien, his assistant, young, brilliant, and with a connection to Annunzio that went beyond academia. Speculation about their relationship was inevitable. Some called it professionalism. Others considered it a poorly disguised romance. Now, with her body abandoned in an alley, every aspect of her life became a clue. Was his murder related to his trip to Thailand? Or had danger always been waiting for him at home? The rain had washed the blood from the cobblestones, but it could not erase the evidence. The crime scene had been kept in the gloom of the early morning, hidden from passers-by and protected by the solitude of a cul-de-sac. With no direct witnesses, no neighbors who had seen anything unusual, the case seemed to stagnate in a lack of answers, until the footage surfaced. 2 blocks from where Trent Annunzio was found, a security camera captured a key fragment in the investigation. At 2:32 a.m., the image showed a tall, stocky man walking in the rain. The dark clothing, with no visible logos or markings, indicated that he was not just a passerby. His step was steady, without hesitation, without looking around. He was not lost or wandering aimlessly. He moved with the assurance of someone who knew exactly where he was going and what he had to do. Police records confirmed his identity. Raul Ramirez, a well-known name in certain circles. No fixed residence, no steady employment, no legal trail linking him to any formal activity. His record included multiple prior arrests for weapons possession, illicit association, and suspicion of homicide. A contract killer with a methodical and discreet profile. His trademark was quick executions, with precise shots that left no margin for error. The shots in Annunzio's eyes matched his method. Each shot had been executed with surgical precision, without dispersion, without a trace of hesitation. There was no sign of struggle in the victim, indicating that the attack was certain, with no possibility of reaction. Annunzio had no chance to defend himself, not even to understand what was happening before collapsing on the garbage. The questions were many, but one question was most pressing. Ramirez had no connection to the victim. There was no history of encounters, of disputes, of outstanding debts. Annunzio did not belong to a world of violence. He was not someone who walked through spaces where a hitman could find him by chance. If Ramirez killed him, he did not do it for personal reasons. He did it to order. When he was arrested, there was no confession. His attitude was not defiant or nervous. He did not show signs of anxiety or attempt to justify his presence at the scene. He did not admit to shooting, nor did he deny his participation. He knew that his silence was his best defense. However, there was something he could not hide. His phone revealed that, shortly before the time of the murder, he received a text message. The content of the message was direct, without unnecessary details. A brief order, sent from a number with no previous records in any database. An untraceable number. The message indicated the target. Trent Annunzio was to die. Nothing more. No explanations, no names. Just the order. Records confirmed that the follow-up call never came. There were no visible payments, no traceable transfers. No subsequent contact with the sender. Everything was calculated so that the relationship between the giver of the order and the executor remained hidden. Ramirez had no motive of his own to have killed Anuncio. He had no personal reasons, he had no previous conflicts, he had no links with his entourage. He had only followed instructions, which meant that somewhere, as yet unidentified, was the person who had decided that Anuncio must die. Someone who knew his movements, who knew when and where to find him vulnerable. Someone who left no direct traces, but who had enough power to hire a professional and disappear without a trace. The question was no longer who fired the shots. That answer was settled. The question was who ordered it, and why. Detective Henry Graves knew that Brendan O'Brien was not just an academic assistant. She was the person closest to Trent Annunzio at the university, who had access to his office, his papers, his schedule. Her role in the investigation was inevitable. When she was called in for questioning, O'Brien showed no surprise. Her attitude was a mixture of discomfort and caution. She was not frightened, but neither was she confident. She knew she was being investigated, but she seemed convinced that they could prove nothing against her. The initial questions were routine. His professional relationship with Anuncio, his routine at the university, his last encounters with the victim. Her answers were calculated, measured, offering no more information than necessary. But the interrogation changed tone when the detective placed a letter of recommendation signed by Anuncio on the table. It was not what O'Brien expected to see. The document was a negative evaluation, a direct obstacle in his career. Promotion in the academy depended on these letters. Professors recommended, assistants climbed. But Anunzio had closed that door for her. He had condemned her professionally. The pressure in the room increased. He was asked if he had conflicts with the victim. His face hardened. He did not deny the tension, but neither did he explain it. The rumors at the university were known. O'Brien had maintained a relationship with Anunzio, a relationship that, according to unofficial versions, was not entirely professional. The interrogation progressed, but it was when the detective mentioned the most recent find that his attitude changed. In his apartment, hidden among his belongings, a disposable telephone was found. The same telephone number used to contact Raul Ramirez. The evidence was clear. She had organized the murder. His face paled. The facade of indifference broke down. For the first time, he seemed to realize that he had no way out. She tried to explain. She said she was fired for personal reasons. She refused to give details. She remained steadfast in her silence. But then, almost without realizing it, he asked a question. Not about the case. Not about the hitman. He asked about Anuncio's wife. The detective did not respond. He didn't have to. The question spoke for itself. The connection to the murder was already traced. O'Brien had hired Ramirez. The motive was still not entirely clear. Revenge, desperation, fear of being exposed. But the evidence was sufficient. She was arrested, not on suspicion, not because of possibility, for murder. Detective Henry Graves was not convinced. Something about Brendan O'Brien's questioning had left him uneasy. When the assistant was cornered by the evidence, he didn't ask about his defense, or the hitman, or his future. He asked about Anuncio's wife. It was a question that made no sense at the time. O'Brien had no apparent reason to care about June, unless there was a hidden connection between them. Graves decided to follow that lead. June Anuncio was summoned for questioning as the victim's widow. From the outset, her attitude was strange. She showed no shock, no anger, none of the heart-rending grief that others would have expected from a woman who had just lost her husband. She was serene, restrained, as if all this was simply a formality to be endured. The initial questions were routine. Details of her marriage, her husband's routine, their relationship in recent months. Her answers were mechanical, as if she had already rehearsed them. But as the detective began to delve deeper into the nature of his relationship with Anuncio, the cracks began to show. It was not a happy marriage. June didn't say it directly at first, but Details began to emerge in his responses. The arguments were constant. Annunzio not only controlled her, but subjected her to humiliating and sadistic situations. The conversation changed tone when Graves brought up an unexpected piece of evidence. A document found in Annunzio's house. A torture manual. It was not an academic text. It was not part of their study material. It was an obsession. A record of detailed physical and psychological punishments meticulously documented. Jun's face changed. The restraint disappeared. His skin tightened. His breathing became heavier. He denied at first. He said he knew nothing about it. But then he spoke. What it revealed was worse than Graves had anticipated. Annunzio didn't just control it. He used it. At home, in her private life, she was not his wife. She was his property. There were recordings, images and videos of forced sex acts documented by Annunzio without his consent. Graves watched the mask of coolness crumble. June was on the verge of a breakdown, but not of sadness, of rage. It was impossible for a woman in her position not to have a motive to murder her husband, but there was still a problem. June had the cell phone, but not the resources. Annunzio did not die in a fit of rage. He was executed by a professional hitman. She did not have access to those kinds of contacts. She did not have the means to hire Raul Ramirez. Someone else should have intervened. The detective looked at her carefully and asked the key question. What was your relationship with Brendan O'Brien? The silence in the room grew thicker. Jun didn't blink, but his cheeks flared with a slight blush. He did not deny anything. He didn't try to evade the question. He just exhaled slowly and confessed. They had been lovers. She and O'Brien were in a relationship. It was at that point that the case changed direction. Annunzio knew it. Annunzio discovered them. And now he was dead. The case had taken an unexpected turn. June Annunzio and Brendan O'Brien were nothing but accomplices, the victim had discovered. Both admitted that their relationship was real, that Annunzio knew about it, but that he simply went on a trip after discovering them. For the police, the confession cleared up some doubts, but it opened up a new problem. June's marriage was nothing more than a contract to stay in the United States. Annunzio controlled her, humiliated her, kept her, but never let her leave completely. When he went to Thailand, they saw an opportunity. O'Brien tried to cut all ties with the university. Jun tried to free himself from the prison in which he lived. But the murder happened later. They both had reasons. They both had reasons to hate him, but neither killed him. Detective Henry Graves rechecked the schedules. The night of the murder, Jun was at the Chinese embassy. There was a solid alibi. O'Brien didn't mention it in his first interrogation because he thought Jun had done it, and if she had, she wouldn't rat her out. But the truth was different. It wasn't them. The hitman did not receive orders from either of them. They didn't have the contacts, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the possibility to do it. But someone else does. The only remaining clue was the trip. Annunzio returned from Thailand suddenly. His stay was planned for months, but he returned earlier. He returned in a hurry, as if running away from something. Detective Graves knew the answer was not in his marriage. It was in what Annunzio had brought with him from his last trip. Detective Henry Graves knew that the only real lead was Annunzio's trip to Thailand. There was no conclusive evidence against either Jun or O'Brien. Both had reason to want him dead, but not the resources or the opportunity. He decided to pursue the only line of investigation open. He contacted the Thai police to obtain all of the professor's records from his last stay. The result was surprising. Annunzio had not been involved in any suspicious activity. There were no meetings with criminal figures, no ties to the smuggling world, and no underground contacts. He had only visited one doctor. Intrigued, Graves called the Thai specialist, a renowned oncologist, surprised by the call from the American police. He knew nothing about Annunzio's murder, nor did he know his personal or professional life in depth. He only knew one thing. Annunzio was dying. The diagnosis was clear. ocular cancer with metastasis to the brain. The disease was advanced, with no possibility of effective treatment. He had only a few months to live. The revelation completely changed the perception of the case. If Annunzio was inevitably going to die, then his murder was not simply an act of revenge or a passionate settling of scores. Someone had hastened his death. The question now was not only who killed him, but why someone wanted to make sure he didn't reach the end on his own. The case had taken an unexpected turn. The motive for the murder was not what everyone thought. Detective Henry Graves had followed every lead, reconstructed every move, questioned every suspect. The crime had all the markings of an execution: a calculated murder, a professional hitman, a burner phone, clues that seemed to fit perfectly into a revenge scheme. But one piece didn't fit. Trent Annunzio was dying. The cancer had devoured his eyes and spread to his brain. He had but months to live, increasingly in pain, increasingly blind, increasingly impaired. Why would anyone spend resources to assassinate a man who would soon die on his own? The answer came when Graves analyzed all the evidence together, not with the eye of a detective solving a murder, but with the eye of someone who understood human nature in its darkest moments. He reviewed the security images again. Ramirez, the hitman, arrived at the scene without extreme caution, as if he was not afraid that someone would see him. He was not wearing gloves. He didn't bother to hide his tracks. It was as if he knew they would never have a connection to whoever hired him. Phone records showed something else strange. The phone used to contact the killer turned up in O'Brien's house, but without any prints directly linking it to its use. Forensic evidence was the final piece. In Annunzio's stomach were found 2 Chinese medicinal herbs, traditionally used to soothe pain and slow down the activity of the nervous system. Their ingestion before death made no sense if he had not planned what was going to happen. Microscopic analysis of their eye sockets revealed traces of cancer cells in the tissues destroyed by the bullets. The shots were not only accurate, they were planned to erase any evidence of his illness. And then Graves understood. Annunzio hired Raul Ramirez to kill him. It was not a murder. It was an orchestrated suicide. He chose the way he would die. He decided to erase the trace of his illness and turn his death into an enigma. He wanted to make his departure a final game of manipulation, a coded message that would confuse everyone around him. But his plan went beyond a cover-up. He wanted to do harm even in death. To ensure that his death would not be seen as a suicide, he placed the phone in Brendan O'Brien's things, knowing that his assistant had personal reasons for wanting him dead. He knew that under pressure O'Brien would confess to anything to protect Jun. It was his ultimate revenge. He became his own murderer, but let others pay the price for his death. His hatred, his resentment, his desire to have the last word did not die with him. In his death, he turned the others into pieces in his endgame. The case was closed with an unusual conclusion. Trent Annunzio's murder was never such. There was no revenge, no conspiracy, no killer with ulterior motives. The perpetrator was the victim himself. He hired Raul Ramirez to execute him with surgical precision, erasing the evidence of his illness and ensuring that his death would not be seen as a simple suicide. He became his own killer, but not without dragging others into the process. By placing the phone in Brendan O'Brien's hands, he manipulated the narrative, knowing that the investigation would point to her, forcing her to confess what she was hiding so much: her relationship with Jun and the torment they both experienced under his control. Even in death, Annunzio did not go unharmed. In his last act, he left behind a puzzle designed to entangle all those around him, ensuring that his presence would continue to haunt them from beyond the grave. He was not killed by an enemy. He was killed by his own will. And with that revelation, the case was officially closed. Case 4. The Deerfield forest was dense and silent, barely disturbed by the murmur of the wind through the treetops. At 6:12 a.m., a hunter walking a dirt trail stumbled upon something that didn't belong in the landscape: one body. The man backed away instinctively. The victim, a middle-aged white man, lay in the brush. his face unrecognizable from the brutality of the blows. The skull showed obvious fractures. His jaw hung at an unnatural angle. The torso showed signs of a prolonged attack, with deep bruising and several broken ribs. His hands were mangled, as if he had tried in vain to protect himself. There were no signs of stabbing or gunshot wounds. The cause of death was neither quick nor precise. It was a beating. Officers arrived shortly thereafter and began inspecting the scene. The robbery seemed an obvious explanation. She didn't have her wallet, cell phone, or watch, but one detail caught the investigators' attention. One of his twins was missing. The other was still on his wrist, stained with blood, a small metal accessory in the shape of a motorcycle wheel. Some officers suggested that it was a robbery that ended in homicide. Perhaps the victim was intercepted on the road, beaten, and abandoned. But the intensity of the aggression raised doubts. A simple robbery rarely left such a body. Detective Henry Graves arrived on the scene minutes later. He observed the corpse, the disarray of clothing, the wounds inflicted with uncontrolled violence. This was not a quick execution. Someone took their time. Someone wanted him to suffer. Robberies ended with a quick shot or stabbing. But this was personal. The missing cufflink could be an unimportant detail, an object plucked in the confusion. Or it could mean something more. The only sure thing was that this had not been a simple assault. Detective Henry Graves reviewed the victim's background with the caution of someone who knew that the dead were rarely innocent. Middle-aged Gordon Hodge was not a model citizen. His record was riddled with contradictions. Although on the surface he led a stable life, his past suggested another reality. Drug use had accompanied him for years. His name appeared in several investigations related to trafficking and distribution, although he had never received formal convictions. A previous arrest for possession, the charges of which were mysteriously dropped, left an open question. Did he have contacts protecting him, or was he cooperating with the police? Hodge's name was also linked to the Sinner Saints motorcycle gang, a group with a long criminal history ranging from drug smuggling and car theft to organized violence. His relationship with them was not entirely clear. Was he an active member or just an occasional collaborator? What was certain was that he had not completely left his past behind. Despite his troubled background, he had a family. He was married to Nina Hodge, his wife of more than a decade. Together they had a son, Lucas, a teenager who grew up in the midst of his father's double life. As Graves went over every detail, the idea of a simple robbery became fainter. He was not a man to get into trouble with strangers. If Gordon Hodge was murdered, his death was not random. Someone wanted him dead. And with his background, there was more than one person who might have had reason to do so. Detective Henry Graves drove to the Hodge family residence. The house was modest, with signs of wear and tear, reflecting a life marked by uncertainty. It was not the home of a stable family, but of people who had learned to live with chaos. When Nina Hodge opened the door, her face reflected not only the grief of a widow, but the rage of someone who had endured too much. Eyes bloodshot, jaw tense, hands folded tightly across her chest. She did not try to hide her resentment. He did not ask for justice. He showed no surprise. Her son, Lucas, a thin, serious teenager, stood in the doorway of the room. He wasn't crying. He didn't ask who had killed his father. He just listened, with the hardened expression of someone who already knew this would happen sooner or later. Gordon Hodge's description was that of a man in a downward spiral, always in bars, always in fights, never present. No matter how much he promised to change, he was back to alcohol, back to the street, back to the life he claimed to have left behind. Nina did not try to defend him. She did not speak of him as a victim. To her, Gordon was a man who had been lost long ago, and his death had only been the expected end of a story that had already been written. Lucas didn't say much. When the detective asked him about his father, he just lifted his shoulders and averted his gaze. He had learned years ago that expecting something from him only led to disappointment. What was clear was that no one in that house would miss him, but that didn't mean they didn't want to know who had killed him. Not for revenge, just to close a chapter that had been open for too long. As he left the Hodge house, Detective Henry Graves noticed a silhouette in the distance. A black motorcycle was parked in front of a house across the street. Its driver seemed to be watching the scene carefully, as if she expected to see something in particular before driving away. But when Graves pulled out onto the street, the motorcycle started up with a bang. It was not a simple coincidence. Someone who has nothing to hide does not run away. The officers reacted immediately and managed to intercept her a few blocks away. Felicia Guthrie. Her reputation preceded her. Linked to bikers, known in the roadhouses, someone who navigated the shadier circles without fully committing herself. She didn't quite belong to the Sinner Saints gang, but her closeness to them made her suspect. When she was taken to the station for questioning, her attitude was a mixture of defiance and caution. He denied running away. He said he was simply passing through the neighborhood. He denied any connection to the murder of Gordon Hodge. He said he had only been near the house to see what his family was saying, who they blamed, if anyone had already been arrested. When asked about his relationship with the victim, he stated that they were friends, that they met in biker bars, that they drank together more times than he could remember, that they had shared conversations about life, about problems, and about the dangerous world in which they moved. But his story was full of contradictions. He couldn't remember when he last saw Gordon. He could not explain why he had left the place in such a hurry. She had no coherent answer when asked if he owed her anything or if they had argued in the past. Meanwhile, officers searched his home, and there they found the first hard physical evidence: Gordon Hodge's missing twin, hidden in the garbage of his residence. A small object, perhaps insignificant in another context, but in a murder where everything seemed to have been stolen, a single missing accessory meant so much more. When he was informed of the find, his attitude changed drastically. He became exalted. His previously relaxed posture became tense. He tried to give hurried explanations, but his voice trembled. And then he blurted out two names: Vaughn McBride, Constance, names that Detective Henry Graves had not heard in the investigation up to that point. Names that, until now, were not on the police radar. But if Felicia mentioned them at that moment, so quickly, it meant they had the missing answer. The case no longer revolved solely around her. Now there were more players in the story, and the truth was closer to coming out. The biker bar was at its peak of activity when the officers burst in. The smell of tobacco and alcohol permeated the air, the hoarse voices of the bikers booming over the distorted music of an old jukebox. No one seemed surprised when the police entered, but the mood changed as soon as they laid eyes on Vaughn McBride. He was at his usual table with a half-finished glass of whiskey and an impassive expression. He asked no questions as they surrounded him. There was no struggle or resistance. He knew that sooner or later they would be looking for him. When he was escorted into the interrogation room, his expression did not vary 1 millimeter. He sat calmly, resting his arms on the metal table, watching with the indifferent air of someone who had been in that same position before. He did not ask why he was there. I knew why, and I also knew what not to say. Gordon Hodge was dead, a man who had been too close to the world of the Sinner Saints, but never close enough inside. He wasn't one of them, but he wasn't an outsider either. He was on the edge, right where no one wants to be. Close enough to know secrets, outside enough to be untrustworthy. When asked about him, McBride just shook his head. He didn't know anything, wasn't involved, had no idea why anyone would want him dead. But his story had cracks. He claimed that he was in the bar all night. He said there were 30 witnesses who could confirm this. But not all witnesses seemed so sure. Some saw him at the beginning of the night, others after the murder, but no one could say with certainty exactly where he was at the time of the crime. The inconsistencies did not give him away as the killer, but they placed him at the epicenter of the mystery. Then, something changed. When the conversation turned to the possible reason for Hodge's murder, McBride finally showed a reaction. Not surprise, not denial, just a slight exhalation, an imperceptible tension in his jaw. Hodge was not a clean man. He had been in trouble with the law, but never served time. He had been arrested for drugs, but the charges disappeared without explanation. Perhaps because he had powerful friends. Or maybe because I was talking to the wrong people. Detective Henry Graves observed every micro-gesture on McBride. The man was not the killer. If he was, he wouldn't be so calm. But he did know something, and for the first time in the interrogation, his silence was not just a strategy, it was a warning. Maybe Gordon Hodge wasn't killed because of a fight. Maybe someone killed him because he had said something he shouldn't have said. Because in a world like Sinner Saints, a snitch doesn't live long. The atmosphere in the interrogation room felt heavy, charged with a tension that Constance Hoyt, or as she was known in biker circles, Diamond, didn't try to disguise. Sitting across the table, her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw clenched, gave away that she wasn't there to help anyone. Her sharp gaze rested on Detective Henry Graves's every move, fearlessly, without hesitation. I knew what was at stake. She was no stranger to the police. She had been part of that world of asphalt, speed, and secrets for far too long. Her history with Von McBride, now her ex-boyfriend, had kept her close to the Sinner Saints gang, but never inside. Always on the edge, always on the margin, always walking a tightrope. But the real surprise in his file was not his relationship with McBride. It was her relationship with Gordon Hodge. It was not a clandestine love. It was a connection forged in need and fear. Both were outcasts in that world. Both are considered whistleblowers. And in such an environment, being a snitch was not just an insult. It was a death sentence. When asked about Hodge, his attitude changed. The disdain disappeared for a moment. He did not try to deny it. He knew him. I knew him too well. I knew he was impulsive, violent with his tongue and hands. I knew he was a man who didn't know when to shut up, who always said too much, who had a problem controlling his anger. More than once, their arguments ended in blows. More than once, he dragged her with him on his motorcycle to his own home when his wife and child were away. And when they were finally discovered, Hodge had no shame or regret. He just screamed and walked away. He was not a man who knew when to stop. Not with her. Not with anyone. But that did not make her his killer. His alibi was solid. Minutes before his death, Hodge received a call from Diamond. Police confirmed that he was at a completely different location from the crime scene. He could not have killed him. But that did not exempt her from being involved. Officials believed that his link to the victim may have been key to his fate. Maybe Hodge told him something he shouldn't have. Perhaps someone in the band discovered that the two had too much in common. But Constance was unwilling to give answers. He did not deny their relationship. He did not deny that Hodge had made enemies within the Sinner Saints. But neither did he say anything that could turn her into another person, marked by the same fate as he was. In the world in which he moved, cooperating with the police meant only one thing: becoming the next body dumped in a forest. And Diamond was not going to make the same mistake as Gordon. The Gordon Hodge case had baffled the police from the beginning. A brutal murder, a body left in the woods, a robbery that did not appear to be a simple assault. Everything pointed to a settling of scores, but something about the crime scene didn't fit. The first suspicions centered on the world Gordon frequented. Biker bars, contacts with the Sinner Saints, previous drug arrests but no real convictions. For most investigators, it was just a matter of finding out which rival in the underworld had decided that Gordon was no longer useful. But when Detective Henry Graves reviewed the case with a closer look, the answers were not in the bikers, they were in their own family.
Gordon was not a good husband. He was not a good father. He wasn't, in fact, good at anything that didn't involve speed, adrenaline, and mayhem. For him, the roar of an engine and the camaraderie in roadside bars were more important than his own home. While his wife and son dealt with the consequences of his lifestyle, he lived as if the responsibility was someone else's burden. To Nina Hodge, his wife, he was a dead weight in the house, someone who promised to change, but never did. someone who would leave without warning and return when it suited him. For his son Lucas, it was a torment. Lucas did not see him as a role model, not even as an authority figure. For him, his father was just an obstacle in his life, a man who always had something to criticize, who humiliated him at every opportunity, who treated him more like a nuisance than a son. Over the years, the tension grew into resentment, and eventually, resentment turned to anger. When Gordon's body was found, the brutality of his murder indicated something personal. It had not been a quick execution. He was not killed with a clean shot. They beat him. They tore him apart. The violence did not match that of a simple assault or a professional elimination. The first suspects were the sinner saints. Gordon had been close to the gang, but never inside. And in a world where loyalty is everything, being an outcast can be dangerous. The names of Felicia Guthrie, Vaughn McBride, and Constance Hoyt came up in the investigation. All had a connection to Gordon. All had reason to want him away, but none of them had a clear motive for killing him. Felicia had been seen near the Hodge home after the murder. Her nervousness and attempt to escape raised suspicions, but her story didn't quite add up. Vaughn McBride maintained his cool, calculating attitude, admitting nothing, denying nothing. His alibi was strong, but not perfect. But if he had wanted to kill Gordon, he would have done it more cleanly. Constance was the key player. When he talked about Gordon's obsession with motorcycles, his disdain for real life, his inability to see beyond adrenaline and speed, Detective Graves understood. Gordon did not live in the real world, and if to him his family was a burden, to his family he was an interruption in their lives. Lucas had shown no emotions when he learned of his father's death. He did not ask who had killed him. He showed no anger or surprise, empty only. From the beginning, his attitude was striking. He didn't look like a grieving son. He looked like someone who was simply waiting for this to happen. When Detective Graves re-examined the testimony, he found minor inconsistencies in Lucas's alibi. At first, the young man claimed he was at home when the murder occurred. But records from his phone and security cameras did not confirm this. There was no evidence that he was at home, but there were traces that he was in the forest. The pressure in the interrogation caused his story to begin to crumble. Finally, he broke down, and he confessed. It was not planned. It was not a premeditated murder. It was an act of pent-up fury. During a driving lesson, Gordon had been crueler than usual. The yelling, the constant criticism, the humiliation. Lucas could take no more. In a fit, he snatched the phone out of her hands and threw it into the woods. Gordon attempted to continue the verbal aggression. Lucas saw a stone on the ground, and he used it. The first blow did not kill him, neither did the second, but he kept on pounding, until his father stopped moving. Lucas ran home not knowing what to do, but his mother knew exactly what to do. Lena Hodge never loved Gordon and he betrayed her, and if her son had just killed him, she wasn't going to let him find out. The crime scene was altered. The wallet, cell phone, and watch were removed to simulate a robbery. But there was one detail that Lucas could not leave behind: his father's pen. The mother took the cufflink and threw it in Felicia Guthrie's trash. If anyone was going to look guilty, it had to be someone who was already in the police's crosshairs. When Felicia was questioned, it was her reaction to the finding of the cufflink that exonerated her. She had no idea how she had gotten home, but someone had placed it there on purpose. Lucas and Lena Hodge's questioning did not stand up to the pressure. Their versions contradicted each other, and when Lucas confessed, the puzzle was complete. Felicia, Vaughn McBride, and Constance were pieces in an investigation that in the end had only one person responsible: a son who spent his whole life accumulating anger, and that, in a single second, he changed his life forever. The case was closed, but what was left behind was not justice. It was a family tragedy in which no one came out on top. Case 5. The Necropolis attraction was designed to provoke fear, to make visitors feel their skin crawl with every shadow, with every unexpected sound. But that night, the horror was real. The screams started when, after the closing, one of the mannequins on the set collapsed to the floor. No one paid attention to it at first. It was just another dummy, part of the show, until it shattered. The remains were neither plastic nor plaster. Among the splinters of the supposed mannequin, human bones peeked out in a tangle of rotting fibers and parched skin. The smell was the next thing to hit. It was not the artificial smell of a haunted attraction. It was real, fetid, heavy, laden with decay. What started out as a fun night out turned into panic. Visitors and employees ran in terror, but not everyone was able to flee. In one of the rooms, a worker remained motionless. Tied with rusty chains, he was part of the set, just another actor in the haunted house setting. But now, his role became a nightmare. I could not escape. I could not run away from the horror they had just discovered. When the police arrived, the attraction's spotlights were still flickering. The emergency lights dyed the papier-mâché walls red, giving the place an even more macabre appearance. Detective Marshall Graves made his way through the officers and the cloud of onlookers still loitering outside the attraction. The stench of death permeated the air. It was not the smell of special effects, but something denser, something that stuck in the throat. Graves crouched down next to the remains of the dummy. The viscous liquid surrounding the bones was not just dried blood or decomposition debris. It was something thicker, with a sticky texture and a strange sheen in the light. With a latex glove, he scraped off a small sample and looked at it closely. Along with the liquid, there was something else, a blue powder. It was not paint. It was not part of the scenery. As he examined it, forensic technicians took photographs and collected samples of the remains. But none of that explained how a corpse had arrived at the attraction unnoticed. An officer approached with information about the security cameras. They were automatically deleted every month. There was no record of who placed the dummy. Worse, there was no purchase order. No one remembered bringing it. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. But the bones inside him were real, and at some point, that mannequin had been a person. The problem was to find out who, and more importantly, who could it be? The mystery of the mannequin had not only horrified those present at Acropolis, but had left the police with more questions than answers. Who was the victim? How had he gotten there unnoticed? Why had his body been disguised as an inert figure? Detective Marshall Graves knew the key was in the remains. Bones don't lie. To identify the victim, forensic scientists resorted to an innovative technique. They poured a putty solution into the mannequin's fragmented skull, allowing them to recreate the victim's facial features accurately. The reconstruction yielded a name. Tim Harker, veterinary assistant, 36 years old, reported missing 5 months ago. The complaint had been filed by his fiancée, who claimed that Tim had left home and never returned. The strange thing was that he lived only a few blocks from Acropolis. His body had been hidden in plain sight. Dental records confirmed his identity, but more questions remained. The autopsy revealed blunt trauma to the skull. Someone had hit him hard enough to kill him. His right hand had 2 broken fingers. Possibly, these injuries occurred when the mannequin fell to the ground, exposing the corpse. There was no doubt. Tim Harker did not die of natural causes. Someone killed him and made his corpse part of the attraction. The question was, who wanted to get rid of him in such a macabre way? Detective Marshall Graves arrived at Ellen Simmons' home with no great expectations. 5 months after reporting her fiancé missing, any real excitement should have faded from him. But his reaction to learning that Tim Harker had been found inside a mannequin in Acropolis was almost indifferent. There was no surprise. He did not ask who had killed him or how he had ended up there. He showed no anger, no pain, no relief. It was her silence that gave him away. But what really caught Graves' attention was not his attitude, but what was in his living room: men's clothing, shirts, a jacket hanging on the back of a chair, even jeans folded over the sofa. They were not Tim's. They could not be. The detective made a mental note. He made no comment about it at the time. He knew that if he pressed her too soon, she would shut down completely. Instead, he started with the basics. He asked if Tim had any relationship with Metropolis. His response was firm, without hesitation.
He never set foot there in his life. But Graves already had evidence to the contrary. There were bank transaction records showing that Tim shopped at a store near Necropolis days before he disappeared. Witnesses had seen him in the area on multiple occasions. And most importantly, his corpse was hidden there for 5 months. It could not be a coincidence. Someone had led him there. And Elena knew more than she was saying. When the detective mentioned the men's clothing in her living room, she tensed. It was a subtle change, but enough to give her away. At first, he tried to ignore the comment. He said it was from his brother, then that a friend had spent the night. But Graves didn't let her off the hook so easily. He kept pushing, waiting for me to make a mistake. Finally, he admitted it. She was not alone. She was in a relationship with another man, Lou Jasper. That name completely changed the direction of the investigation. Up to that point, Jasper did not figure anywhere in the case. If Elena had a relationship with him, how long had it been going on? Had it started after Tim's disappearance, or before? If Tim discovered the deception, how far were Elena and her lover willing to go to cover it up? Detective Graves noticed another crucial detail. Elena insisted that she had not been to Necropolis, but witnesses claimed otherwise. She had been seen near the attraction around the same time Tim disappeared. If Tim had really never been there, then what was Elena doing there? The story he had told no longer made sense. What at first appeared to be a simple disappearance was now shaping up to be something much more sinister. The detective knew what he had to do. Lou Jasper was the next person to question. Understood. I correct the detail about Jean Farrow and keep the rest of the text intact, ending in the same place. Detective Marshall Graves arrived at the sprawling Necropolis construction site, where the sound of saws and hammers mingled with the cement dust. There stood Lou Jasper, moving through the rubble with the calm of someone accustomed to routine. The officers escorted him to the patrol car without resistance. He didn't ask why he was being taken or demand answers. He just looked at them with the same expressionlessness with which he would look at a nail hammered into a board. In the interrogation room, his attitude remained just as cool. He showed no signs of discomfort, anger, or fear. When Detective Graves asked him about Elena Simmons, Jasper answered without hesitation. He said yes, they were together. He made no attempt to cover it up. But the real test came later. How did he feel living in Tim Harker's apartment? Jasper didn't flinch. He didn't change his expression or try to justify himself. His silence was an insurmountable wall. It wasn't going to make him lose control. Graves did not insist. He knew that some people don't fall under pressure, but they do fall under the right strategy. Changing tactics, he led him to talk about his work at Necropolis. Jasper matter-of-factly explained that his routine took him to the prep room every day. He operated tools like the table saw, worked on the attraction structures, and had access to all the spaces where the sets were prepared. There was nothing unusual about his presence there, but forensic evidence indicated that Tim Harker's corpse had been treated in that same room. Jasper kept his expression neutral. He didn't deny having been there, but neither did he admit to knowing anything else. It was then that Graves threw out the key question, if it wasn't you, who was it? For the first time in the conversation, Jasper averted his gaze. He was silent for a moment, and then he said a name. Jean Farrow. The detective immediately made a note of it. Jean Farrow had not shown up earlier in the investigation. But if Jasper was pointing him out, it meant there was something there. Maybe Jasper wasn't the killer. Maybe he simply knew more than he wanted to admit. But what was certain was that Jean Farrow had just become the new key piece in the case. Graves reviewed the available files on Jean Farrow. She was a middle-aged woman with a background in construction and maintenance. She had worked on projects similar to Necropolis, although she had never been mentioned by other employees during early interviews. The detective decided to dig deeper into her background. If Jasper had singled out Farrow, there had to be a reason. Or maybe Jasper was just deflecting attention. Graves couldn't rule out either possibility. Meanwhile, the forensic team continued to analyze the evidence found in the preparation room. There were traces of blood and fibers that matched Tim Harker's clothing. They also found partial prints on some tools. although they had not yet been able to fully identify them. Everything seemed to point to someone with regular access to the site, someone like Jasper or Pharaoh. The detective returned to the interrogation room for a second round with Jasper. This time he began by mentioning Jean Pharaoh. He asked if Jasper knew Pharaoh well, if they had worked together, or if they had ever argued. Jasper responded tersely. He said that he knew Pharaoh, but that they were not close. He offered no further details. Graves changed the subject and asked again about the night Tim Harker was last seen. Jasper repeated what he had said before, that he had been working late in the prep room and did not recall seeing anything out of the ordinary. The detective noticed that Jasper continued to avoid talking about his own movements after leaving the site. It was as if there was a deliberate gap in his account. The investigation team also began interviewing other Necropolis employees. Some mentioned that Pharaoh used to be reserved, but efficient in her work. Others said they had seen her arguing with Harker weeks before her disappearance. Tensions between the two seemed to revolve around a project that was not moving forward as planned. However, no one could confirm whether that dispute had escalated into something more serious. With each new piece of information, Graves felt the case expanding in several directions. Jasper remained a prime suspect because of his connection to Harker's apartment and his access to the prep room. But Jean Pharaoh now occupied a central place in the investigation. What was certain was that Jean Pharaoh had just become the new key player in the case. Understood. I will expand the text, keeping the original content, and without modifying the established ending. Detective Marshall Graves had interrogated dangerous people before, but Jean Pharaoh was different. He didn't have the restrained aggressiveness of Lou Jasper, nor the calculated falseness of Elena Simmons. His look was curious, almost amused, not like someone afraid of being caught, but like someone who simply enjoyed the macabre. Jean was no ordinary killer. Maybe she wasn't even a killer, but everything about her made her suspicious. Pharaoh didn't work at Necropolis officially, but he spent more time there than many employees. He called himself Necropolitan, as part of a group of fans obsessed with the attraction. To them, Necropolis wasn't just a show, it was a world. But what really put Jean on the police radar wasn't his obsession with Necropolis. It was his art. Jean was in the business of creating ghoulish figures, sculptures, and grotesque dolls inspired by the attraction. Some he sold. Others he kept in his apartment. And among his works, researchers found something chilling. An exact miniature of Tim Harker's body, just as it was found. When Graves confronted her with this, Jean didn't flinch. She showed no surprise. She didn't get nervous. She just shrugged her shoulders. "Why would you do such a thing?" they asked. His response was simple. "Because it's macabre." As if that explains everything. As if that were enough. Fingerprints and doubts. Forensic analysis revealed Jean Pharaoh's fingerprints on the face of the mannequin where Tim's body was hidden. That put her directly at the scene of the crime. When asked why her prints were there, she responded with the same indifference. She said she liked to go into the employee area, that no one was watching her because everyone knew her, that she had probably touched many mannequins before. But that did not explain why his miniature matched the exact position of the real body. Graves changed his strategy. He asked him how he made the figure, and that's where he got his answer. Jean had no idea that Tim Harker had been inside the mannequin until after it was found. He saw the news story. He saw the pictures of the crime in the newspapers, and the idea of recreating it just seemed fascinating to him, because he was macabre, because he liked horror, because that was his art. There was no hidden confession, no attempt to incriminate himself. He simply saw death as a spectacle, as an object of inspiration. Innocent, or just an observer? Despite his disturbing attitude, the evidence against Jean Pharaoh was weakening. Yes, her prints were on the dummy, but so were many others. Yes, his miniature figure was disturbing, but he made it after the crime became public. In addition, forensics uncovered a crucial difference. Jean Pharaoh painted his creations with acrylic, but Tim Harker's body had been covered with latex, two completely different materials. That meant Jean had not handled the body before it was found. Her alibi did not place her at the exact time of the crime. Detective Graves watched her. If it wasn't her who killed Tim Harker, if she had only become obsessed with the case afterwards, who did it? Detective Marshall Graves had spent weeks chasing down leads, separating the facts from the false alibis, identifying what was real evidence from what was just a distraction. The Tim Harker case was full of noise, but in the end, the truth always finds its way. The key was the three pillars of any crime: means, motive, and opportunity. Tim's body was found inside a mannequin in Necropolis, but who put him there, how they killed him, and why they did it was still unclear, until a second, more thorough investigation revealed the details that changed everything. Further inspection of the crime scene revealed microparticles of blood and latex residue trapped in the internal gears of a construction tool. Not only did it confirm that it had been used to inflict lethal trauma, but it was also used to manipulate the body. But what sealed the case was the blue powder found at the scene. Subjected to advanced chemical testing, it was found to be an industrial compound found in building materials. That same material was found in Lou Jasper's slippers, a direct link between him and the place where the corpse was handled. But there was more. The use of luminol and fluorescent fingerprint techniques revealed a partial fingerprint on the surface of the murder weapon. The footprint, hidden under layers of dirt and debris, was compared in databases. Irrefutable coincidence. Lou Jasper. And then there was the final piece. Digital tracking of mobile devices recovered a history of deleted calls. Those calls coincided with the night of Tim Harker's disappearance. They suggested a key communication in the planning of the assassination. Who was Jasper talking to that night? With Elena Simmons. When the evidence was presented, there was no room for doubt. Lou Jasper killed Tim Harker. The reasons were still subject to interpretation, but the evidence indicated that Tim represented an obstacle in Elena and Jasper's relationship. Perhaps Tim discovered the betrayal. Perhaps he confronted his fiancée. Perhaps Jasper decided that the simplest solution was to eliminate it. What was clear was that he killed him, hid his body, and used his access to Necropolis to dispose of him in the most macabre way possible. And Elena knew it. His alibi crumbled with each contradiction in his testimony. If he did not participate in the murder, he knew it happened and helped cover it up. When the officers arrived at his home, he did not resist. Neither she nor Jasper said a word. There was nothing left to say. The case was closed, but the echo of the crime would remain in Necropolis for a long time. Tim Harker's case not only shocked the community, but also drew attention to the brutality of the crime and the manner in which his body was concealed. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, onlookers, and family members of the victim filled every corner. Prosecutors presented a strong and straightforward case. Forensic evidence, Lou Jasper's fingerprint on the murder weapon, the blue powder linking him to the crime scene, traces of latex on his sneakers, and contradictions in his testimony were exposed. In addition, the call history between Jasper and Elena Simmons on the night of the disappearance made it clear that Tim's death was no accident. The defense arguments were weak. They tried to claim that there were no eyewitnesses to the murder, that the murder weapon was commonly used on the construction site, that the blue powder could have been transferred in another way. But the evidence was too strong. After 2 weeks of hearings and deliberations, the jury returned its verdict. Lou Jasper was convicted of second-degree murder. The judge handed down a sentence of 25 years to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole before serving 20 years. Elena Simmons was convicted of concealment and obstruction of justice. His sentence was 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years. The verdict brought legal, but not emotional closure. Tim Harker's family saw justice not as a triumph, but as a foregone conclusion. Necropolis reopened its doors, but the attraction was never the same. The case left an indelible mark on the community. And although the story was closed in the courts, the echo of the crime would continue to resonate in the haunted attraction for a long time. Case 6. The luxury and exclusivity of the Upper East Side were rarely disturbed by chaos. But that night, Titus Delancey's apartment became the epicenter of a crime as enigmatic as it was disturbing. When police arrived on the scene, they found her body on the living room floor. The man, an investment magnate, lay completely motionless, dressed in a tight-fitting black latex suit. The suit covered his body completely, except for his face. But the strangest thing was not the attire. It was the context. The apartment showed no signs of a struggle. Everything was in place. There was nothing to indicate that anyone had struggled with Titus prior to his death. But then the first clues began to appear. On a side table, investigators found a half-empty glass of bourbon and an open bottle. Detective Marshall Graves examined the contents of the glass. A viscous residue was floating on the surface of the liquor. Something didn't fit. After a rapid combustion test, the residue was identified as nitroglycerin, a potent vasodilator. But in high doses, it can induce cardiovascular collapse. Titus was not only dead, he had been poisoned. Near the body, an empty bottle of talcum powder. At first glance, it seemed logical. Talc is often used to facilitate the donning of latex suits. But Graves noticed something strange. If Titus had put on the suit by himself, as they tried to make believe, why wasn't there enough talc inside the suit? Someone else put it on after he died. It was a clumsy attempt to divert attention from the real crime. What looked like an accident related to sexual fetishes, it was actually a carefully disguised murder. The hallway security camera captured a hooded figure entering the building shortly before Titus's death. His face could not be seen. No fingerprints were left. There were no records of incoming or outgoing calls on the victim's phone during that period. The entry was not forced. The killer knew exactly what he was doing. But the key was one person who knew Titus Delancey's habits well. Someone who was there before his body was discovered. Mistress Felicia. Detective Graves knew she would be the next to be questioned. Detective Marshall Graves arrived in the interrogation room knowing that Mistress Felicia was the only person, so far, who could shed light on the death of Titus Delancey. She was no stranger to him. A professional dominatrix, known in exclusive circles. Someone who handled powerful and discreet clients. There was no criminal record in her background, but her work placed her in a gray area where secrets were currency. She was the first person to find the body and the one who called the police. His testimony was crucial but also problematic. Felicia stated that she had been hired for a private session with Titus Delancey. When she arrived, she found the apartment door ajar. The silence inside made her uneasy. As she entered the room, she saw him on the floor, motionless, still wearing the tight-fitting latex suit. He said he tried to revive him, but knew immediately that he was dead. He reached for his phone and called 911. His version seemed credible, but there were inconsistencies. Felicia insisted that Titus never mentioned feeling ill before the encounter. But at autopsy, it was determined that he died of heart failure induced by nitroglycerin in his drink. Detective Graves asked him if he had seen anything unusual at the scene. So if she didn't kill him, who tried to cover up the crime? When shown the security camera footage, he acknowledged that he had not seen anyone strange in the building. But the image of the hooded figure entering the compound minutes before death was impossible to ignore. The individual could not be identified, but someone had been in the apartment before her. Someone who may have manipulated the scene. Felicia had no alibi to prove that she was not there before what she said, but there was also no evidence that she was responsible. The only clear thing was that someone tried to make the scene look like something it wasn't. And if Felicia wasn't the culprit, who was using her as a distraction? Detective Marshall Graves' investigation soon revealed that Titus Delancey was no ordinary man. CEO of Delancey Capital Group, one of Wall Street's most influential firms, a man of power, wealth, and absolute control, but also a man with enemies. Authoritarian, manipulative, meticulous in his public image. To many, his life seemed perfect. A model wife, 2 teenage children, an assured fortune. But behind that facade were risks, secrets, and a clear motivation for his murder. Titus was nearing retirement. His retirement meant a payment of $125 million, a figure that would secure him for the rest of his life. But there was one condition: the moral clause. If any immoral or illegal conduct was discovered, the bonus would be voided. And his fondness for fetishistic practices was not something that could come to light without consequences. If someone wanted to destroy him, he did not need to murder him, just expose it. But instead of a scandal, Titus Delancey ended up dead, and that meant someone had reason to make sure there were no second chances. Someone who could not afford to have Titus still alive. The question was not just who killed him. The question was who had the most to gain from his death. Detective Marshall Graves reviewed the security camera footage from Titus Delancey's building over and over again. The image showed a hooded figure entering the apartment shortly before the body was discovered. The video quality was poor. The face was covered, the posture was neutral, with no obvious details. But there was one thing Graves knew well: images always tell a story, even when they seem to hide more than they reveal. The forensic team worked with the material in search of clues. The dimensions of the body, the way she walked, small details that could not be hidden under her clothes. And then, a coincidence arose. Coat, a specific high-end model, only distributed to a small circle of exclusive customers, one that had been captured at corporate events, one that Burt Jeffries had used on more than one occasion. With that information in hand, Graves ordered to track their movements. Jeffries had claimed to be in the office that night, and he had witnesses to confirm it. But his phone was detected in the apartment area during a key time period. When he was brought in for questioning, his reaction gave him away before he even spoke. He knew he had been caught in a lie. At first, Jeffries tried to play it down. He said yes, he went to Titus's apartment. He said yes, he had worn the latex suit. He said yes, he called Mistress Felicia to make sure someone found him in a compromising situation. But he insisted on something firmly. It did not kill him. His plan was not to assassinate Titus, but to discredit him. He knew about the morale clause in his retirement contract. He knew that if Titus was exposed in a fetish scandal, he would lose his $125 million retirement. And that meant that executive bonuses within the company, including his own, would increase. In addition, Titus never guaranteed that he would remain in charge after his departure. If his reputation was destroyed, Jeffries had the perfect opportunity to assume leadership. But everything changed when he entered the apartment. Titus was already dead. The plan to destroy his career stopped being a mere scandal and became a real problem. Jeffries froze for a moment. And then he made the worst possible decision. He went ahead with his plan. He placed the latex suit on the corpse. He arranged the scene to look like an accident in the middle of a private game. And he waited for Mistress Felicia to arrive and discover the body. But there was a problem he could not explain. The autopsy confirmed that Titus died of nitroglycerin-induced heart failure. The bourbon glass found at the scene contained traces of the poison, but Jeffries never mentioned touching the bottle or handling the drink. Witnesses confirmed that he was in the office most of the night. He had no way of having poisoned Titus. And yet, Titus Delancey was dead. Jeffries had the means and opportunity to cover up the scene. But I didn't have the motive to kill him, which meant that someone else wanted him dead. Someone who didn't plan to just ruin his reputation. Someone who made sure Titus Delancey never had a chance to defend himself. Detective Marshall Graves knew that the truth is often closer than it seems. If Burt Jeffries hadn't poisoned Titus Delancey, then the killer had to be someone with direct access to his life. Someone inside the house. And in the Delancey household, few people had unfettered access. The wife, the children, and the nanny. Ann Barker was not an unfamiliar name. Not to those who once followed the most high-profile court cases. Before she was called Ann Barker, her real name was Abigail Spencer. 10 years ago, she was acquitted of murdering her own father. The man was a violent abuser, a monster who turned her childhood into a nightmare. One day, he turned up dead. But justice could never prove that Abigail killed him. She was declared innocent. By changing his identity and his life, he tried to disappear from public attention. She reinvented herself. She became Ann Barker. And 6 months earlier, she entered the Delancey household as their children's nanny. At first, she seemed to get along well with the family. But when Detective Graves questioned her, the answers left more doubts than certainties. When asked how Titus was with his children, Anne hesitated. She said he was a strict father. She said he had a strong temper. She said he could be harsh when he got angry. But what she didn't say, what her body language gave away, was something deeper, something personal, something that reminded her of her own childhood. Titus Delancey was an authoritarian, manipulative man, not a physical abuser. But his presence was domineering, his temper controlling everyone around him. And Anne had seen that kind of man before, all her life. Detective Graves didn't need to ask him if he had killed his father. He knew that. But the question was another. Had he killed Titus Delancey? For the same reason, Anne claimed that on the night of the murder she was in her room checking her phone. But no one could corroborate this. There were no witnesses. There were no records to confirm her activity. She had no alibi. But more importantly, she had a motive. If Titus Delancey reminded her of the man who destroyed her as a child, if she saw him as another version of the monster she once faced, if she felt she had to act before he could hurt someone else, then the question was no longer whether she resented him. It was whether that resentment had driven her to kill again. Graves reviewed Anne's background in more detail. Her past not only included her father's case, she had also worked for other families before the Delanceys. In each, she left the job after minor conflicts, small disputes that were never fully resolved. No one suspected her at the time, but now those stories were beginning to form a disturbing pattern. The detective knew he could not base a case on assumptions alone. He needed solid evidence. He reviewed the forensic reports one more time. The poison used to kill Titus, Perry Delancey, 45, was the wife of Titus Delancey. A former model, she had abandoned her career after marrying him. Her life as the wife of one of the most powerful men in town looked glamorous from the outside, but in reality it was full of tensions and dark secrets. Perry maintained a cold and distant relationship with her husband, who controlled her financially, leaving her dependent on his will. This dynamic had led her to hire a private detective to investigate Titus's possible infidelities. However, what she discovered was far more disturbing. The past of Abigail Spencer, her children's nanny. Perry's motive for murdering Titus was clear. She wanted to divorce him and get a significant share of his fortune. But not only that. She was also willing to allow the sexual abuse Titus had committed against Graham, her youngest son, to come to light. She knew that such a revelation would completely ruin Titus's public image, something that she, with her calculating coldness, didn't seem to care about at all. For Perry, Titus's ruin was not collateral damage, it was part of the plan. But Perry was smart. She knew that if she killed Titus, suspicion would fall on her. So when she discovered Abigail Spencer's dark past, she saw the perfect opportunity to divert attention. If Abigail was accused of the crime, Perry would not only be in the clear, but she would also protect her reputation. After all, no one would want to associate her with a nanny who had once been acquitted of murder. The coldness with which Perry handled the situation was chilling. She showed no emotion when talking about Titus or his possible guilt. She didn't even hesitate to admit that she knew about Graham's abuse. To her, it was all part of a strategic calculation. If Titus had to die so that she could be free of his control and secure her future, then so be it. And if someone else had to bear the consequences, so much the better. Detective Marshall Graves reviewed the details of the case one more time. Perry had hired a private detective to investigate Titus, which showed that she was looking for compromising information. That same investigation led her to discover Abigail's past. Was it possible that Perry had planned it all from the beginning? Had she used her knowledge of Abigail's past to ensure that suspicion would fall on her? Graves also considered Perry's coolness in talking about the abuse to Graham. It was as if he felt no remorse or pain, only unrelenting determination. Perhaps she wanted that secret out in order to destroy Titus's image. Or maybe she simply didn't care who got hurt in the process, as long as she got what she wanted. The detective knew that Perry had access to Titus's life, knew his habits, and could have administered the poison without arousing suspicion. Moreover, his motivation was strong: money, freedom, and revenge. But he also knew that appearances could be deceptive. Although Perry seemed to have all the elements of a cold, calculating killer, Graves could not ignore the possibility that she was using her intelligence to manipulate the narrative and pin the blame on Abigail. If Perry had killed Titus, he had done it so carefully that it seemed almost impossible to prove it. But if he hadn't, who else could have been involved? Detective Marshall Graves went over the details of the case one more time. There were too many loose threads, but they all seemed to converge on one point: Graham Delancey, Titus's oldest son. At 17, Graham was an introverted, reserved teenager with academic and emotional problems that now took on new meaning after the discovery of the videos on the hidden tablet. In those files, something devastating was revealed. Titus had sexually abused his own son. It was a truth so brutal that it completely changed the dynamics of the case. Graham had clear motives for wanting revenge against his father. He not only sought justice for himself, but also to protect his younger brother Zach from future abuse. In addition, as one of the heirs to Titus's considerable fortune, he would have access to a substantial sum after his father's death, although he needed the approval of his mother, Perry, to access the funds. This added another layer of complexity to the case. But what really troubled Graves was the physical evidence. Graham's fingerprints had been found in the file of the private detective hired by Perry, who investigated Abigail Spencer's past. What was Graham doing there? Did he know something about his mother's plan? Or worse, was he using that information to divert attention away from Abigail? The method of the assassination also pointed to Graham. Nitroglycerin dissolved in bourbon was a rare poison, but not impossible to obtain. Perry had reportedly obtained the compound under false medical pretenses, and Graham, living under the same roof, had access to both bourbon and nitroglycerin. The glass used contained traces of the poison, and although there were no clear prints on it, the connection was undeniable. Abigail Spencer had confessed to the crime, but something about her statement didn't add up. Graves suspected she was taking the blame to protect Graham. Perhaps she knew what the boy had suffered and felt some affinity for him because of her own childhood trauma. Or maybe she simply wanted to prevent another innocent from being dragged into the hell she already knew all too well. Graves decided to confront Graham in a secluded spot by the river where no one could hear them. He told him that he knew what he had done, but that he understood the extreme circumstances that led him to commit the crime. Graham didn't deny anything. He just looked at the water as tears streamed down his face. Graves made a difficult decision: not to denounce him publicly. He knew that bringing a teenage victim of abuse to trial would be cruel and unfair. Besides, Titus's death had already freed the family from his tyrannical control. The case was officially closed with Abigail Spencer's confession, although Graves knew the truth. Graham had used the knowledge of his father's abuse to manipulate the crime narrative and divert attention to Abigail. Everything was calculated, cold, and methodical. Ultimately, the murder of Titus Delancey was an act of revenge and protection. Graham sacrificed his own innocence to free his family from the monster that had tormented them for years. And although he would never be formally tried, the weight of what he had done would stay with him for the rest of his life. The trial of Abigail Spencer was conducted under intense media attention, with the darker details of the case coming to light. Despite suspicions and circumstantial evidence pointing to her, Detective Marshall Graves was unable to find conclusive evidence to prove that she had administered the poison that killed Titus Delancey. Abigail stood by her initial confession, taking the blame for a crime many believed she did not commit, possibly to protect Graham or even Perry. The jury, torn between the lack of hard forensic evidence and her murky past, ultimately ruled that there was not enough certainty to find her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Abigail was again acquitted, leaving the case shrouded in a shadow of uncertainty as Graves watched from afar, aware that the real truth would probably never come out.